It's really good to be here and hear all these great talks. So as you can see, I do study intergroup conflict, just not in humans. I study non-human primates, specifically wild monkeys, not chimpanzees. So there are some differences here between monkeys and chimpanzees, and then primates in general, or non-human primates versus humans, and I'll go through this. And I also want to start by talking about some of the variability that we see in non-human primate interactions. Now remember that there are a lot of primates in the world, 300 to 400 depending on how you count. So of course there's a lot of variation among these species, and in particular the aspects of variation that I'm interested in are who participates and what is the function of their participation. So in some species you see that females are fighting, others you see males are fighting, sometimes you see both sexes participating in a particular conflict. And then there are other instances where neither sex is being aggressive during a conflict, and what that means is that two groups have come into spatial proximity, but there's no aggression. It's a neutral encounter. Most of the time when we're talking about monkey intergroup interactions, we're talking about one whole group of males and females interacting with another whole group of males and females. This is most interactions. However, there are some exceptions to this. Sometimes we see subgroup interactions where one or two individuals from one group will travel a fairly significant distance to interact with a neighboring group. They'll cause some havoc and then run back to their own group. So that's a subgroup interaction. Also, I should point out that, is this a pointer? So sometimes in the whole group versus whole group interactions, you have a lot of individuals, or most individuals from both groups who are engaging in this sort of pitched battle. Other times what we see are interactions that resemble duels where one or a few individuals, oftentimes these are males, are interacting with just one or a few individuals from the other group. So these are much smaller in scale. And for my research, I mostly focus on interactions between whole groups, but some people also consider interactions with bachelor groups, males who are not yet in a bisexual group. Or they consider interactions with a solitary male who's sort of floating around in the habitat. But I think that the motivations for participating in these sorts of interactions are very different from the motivations for participating in an interaction with a whole group. And I want to stress that there is a lot of variation. There's variation between and within individual in terms of their participation levels. There's variation at the species level, both between and within species. And I also want to stress that for most primate species that are gregarious, they don't live in these fission fusion societies. They live in these cohesive groups where they wake up in the morning, they travel through the forest, and they forage together as a group, and they find a tree to sleep in at night to again, as a group. So when you don't have a fission fusion society, what that means is you don't have the opportunity for coalitional impunity. You don't have this instance where you have 11 members of one group ganging up on a single individual from another group. It's just not possible. So what that results in is a lot fewer lethal instances of aggression in other types of non-human primates outside of chimpanzees. Now the functions of participation, for the most part, we're talking about access to food and access to fertile mates. There are some other types of resources that are occasionally defended in some species or some populations, such as access to water. But for the most part, this is the primary source of conflict between groups. And also, when people talk about defending a territory or defending a home range, I kind of lump that into defending food resources because really what they're defending within that home range are the food resources. And there is defensive action and offensive action in terms of keeping your access to resources versus acquiring access to new resources. So when I started reading the literature on intergroup conflict in primates, to me it looked like a hot mess, all right? Everybody is studying something different and they're using different words to talk about sometimes the same thing, sometimes different things. So it reminded me of this parable of the blind man and the elephant. So everybody's looking at this one entity of intergroup conflict, but they're looking at such different parts of it that they have a very different impression of what's going on. So I wanted to bring some order to this. So here's my plate of spaghetti. The way I think about intergroup conflicts in non-human primates is I have to sort of divide up the things that we're looking at in terms of the dependent variables and the independent variables. So first at the top we have action phases. And first, in species that have long-distance vocalizations, so a vocalization that can be heard across your own home range and then even into the next home range. These are signals to the neighboring group of where you are, and over time as you're giving these calls, they can indicate to those neighboring groups your direction of travel. So groups can choose to either respond to these calls by approaching the caller or moving away or by ignoring. So that is a sort of long-range interaction, right? The groups are not in visual contact, but they're still aware of their neighbors and what their neighbors are doing. Then there's the initiation of short-range interaction. So the groups are close enough that they can hear their short-range vocalizations, but they're not yet close enough that they can see each other. And again, they're presented with this choice. Do we approach or do we withdraw? And then once the groups are within visual contact, they can also initiate physical contact or other forms of aggression, such as chasing. And then we can look at those patterns of agonism or affiliation. In a few species, we see affiliation, not my species. And we can look at the patterns of escalation. We can look at the identity of the fighters and sort of sequences of fighting. So if one individual participates, does that make it more likely for other individuals within the group to also participate? Finally, we can look at the outcome of these interactions, who has access to the resource, who has to change their travel direction or use of habitat areas as a result of the interaction, and the downstream fitness effects in terms of survival and production of infants. Now, in terms of the participant units here, we can look at the actions of individual monkeys, females versus males more generally, or the entire group as a whole. Of course, the amount of information you can get from this level of analysis is a bit limited, so for this talk, I'll first talk a bit about female and male responses and then go into more detail on individual responses. Down here is the important stuff, the motivating hypotheses. I've divvied these up into 3 categories: resource holding potential, expected payoffs, and disposition. Now, it's payoffs that really motivate an individual to participate or not, right? It's access to food or mates. And these other factors, resource holding potential and disposition, modulate that motivation to fight. Typically, in resource holding potential, we're talking about numeric odds or contestant strength. But with some species, we can also look at site-dependent dominance. So for instance, a group might always win within its home range and then always lose outside of its home range. And for disposition, we have things like dominance rank, relatedness within the group, and even to individuals of the neighboring group. The individual's age or tenure within the group and their reproductive phase. So for instance, females with a small clinging infant who has not yet been weaned, that infant is particularly vulnerable, so maybe that female should not be participating in a highly aggressive contest. Now for my study site, I work in Uganda on the western side in Kibale National Park. This is the same park where Richard works, but the site that I'm at is in Gogo, and it's about 12 to 15 kilometers to the southeast of Kanyawara, which is the other major research site. And Ngogo is a great site to work if you want to study monkeys. There's 7 species, diurnal species, so when I get bored with one, I can move to the next. And the density of groups is particularly high because there's a lot of food at Ngogo. And a lot of groups means a lot of interactions, which means a lot of data, which means I can really get at some of these questions about what shapes individual responses or sex-specific responses during these conflicts. So right now I have 6 groups of gray-cheeked mangabes and 6 groups of red-tailed monkeys that I study. So these are the study subjects. I chose them because there's some very important similarities between these 2 species, and yet there are some behavioral differences. And I want to understand the basis for those behavioral differences, and this gives me a really good system to tease things apart. So for red-tailed monkeys, well, let me talk a little bit about some of these similarities. These are monkeys that are in the exact same forest. They're eating from the exact same trees, so they're eating the same foods. They're even traveling together from tree to tree. They have very similar group sizes. They have very similar daily travel distances. And in both cases, females are philopatric. They stay in the groups where they're born for their entire lives. And yet, when we talk about patterns, sex-specific patterns of participation during aggressive intergroup conflict, this is what I saw. So for female food defense, a resounding yes for red-tailed females. Their patterns of aggression correspond very well with the availability of valuable food resources within the home range. Male food defense, again, a resounding yes. Male patterns of aggression also correspond with food availability. Then we look at mangabees, and eating the same foods, traveling together, using the same resources, but there's a slightly different pattern here in terms of food defense. I could not find any correlation between female aggression and the availability of food resources. And this is despite the fact that male mangabees are clearly defending food resources. Their patterns of aggression do correspond with food availability. So they are consuming limiting and defendable food resources, but what is it that's holding back female participation? And after hours and hours, years actually, of following these monkeys, I was pretty sure that it had something to do with male behaviors. In some way, males are constraining females from participating in these fights. But when I looked at the correlation between male herding and female participation, there was no relationship whatsoever. So male mangabees engage in herding, which is a way of chasing females away from the opposing group during the interaction. That being said, the act of herding is not the only thing within a male mangabee's repertoire. Okay? Sometimes they're just sitting at the edge of the group, staring threateningly at their females. There's no chasing, there's no vocalizations, it's just the presence of the male at the edge of the group that seems to be preventing the females from interacting. And mangabee females, when I say no, they're not defending food resources, they are participating in only about 20% of aggressive interactions, and that 20% doesn't correspond with any particular food-related variable. But what it does correspond with is male behavior again. So in a mangabee group, there's typically 3 adult males. One male is running off to the other group and chasing individuals in that other group. The second male is sitting at the edge of his group, staring at his own females and preventing them from interacting with the neighboring group. The third male is typically at the back of his own group, sitting with females and infants, looking like a hired gun type of guy, like defending those infants. And so these are the roles that mangabees play, the male mangabees, during these interactions. But sometimes this breaks down. And the guy who's supposed to be doing the herding, he turns around and starts chasing the opposing group instead of maintaining his position at the front edge of his own group. And when that happens, the females, they join the fray. All right, so this is a very strong predictor of female participation. So I wondered, is this sort of pattern happening with other primate species where we expect females to be participating to defend food resources, but in fact they're either not participating at all or participating at very low rates? So I did a literature review, and the question here is, when do males constrain female participation? And at this point, I have 74 populations representing 48 species. So the nice thing here is that sometimes I have multiple populations for a single species, and sometimes different populations of a species are doing different things. Sometimes you see female food defense, and sometimes you don't. So that gives me a lot of power to understand the drivers of this variation. And in some ongoing analyses with my collaborator, Chris Schmidt at BU, what we're finding is that females participate under 2 conditions. When these 2 conditions are met, then you see high levels of female participation in these aggressive conflicts. First, when they can overcome male attempts to control them. And how do they do that? Either through numbers or body size. So when there's at least 3 females for every 1 male, females can do what they want. They can completely ignore male attempts to control them. Similarly, if female body size is at least 80% of male body size, they can, again, do what they want. The second condition that has to be met to allow for female participation is that the home range is highly defendable. And this is using the standard Mittani and Rodman Defendability Index. And they sort of set as the baseline a value, an index of 1.0 as the minimum requirement for territoriality. But what we see here is, when females are participating, this value is a bit higher. It's actually 1.5. And what this suggests to me is that this is an indication that resources are limiting and defendable within the home range. So this is a proxy for all those other measures of food availability that we've been using in the past. And this is a lot easier to use, I think, frankly. So this is sort of a new hypothesis about female food defense. Hopefully we'll be putting that out soon. So that's all well and good. Now what about male mate defense? And here again we see some differences between red tails and mangabees. When estrus females, fertile females, are present in a red tail group, male red tails are more likely to participate in that conflict and to fight the opposing group. So there's a positive effect of estrus female presence on male behavior. This is the complete opposite of what I see for mangabeys. When estrus females are present in a mangabey group, males are less likely to fight the opposing group. And that really seems to stem from the difference in male mating competition within the group. All right? So in red tails, there's just one male in the group. He doesn't have any mating competition within the group. All of his opponents are outside the group in those neighboring groups, right? So by participating in these conflicts, he's keeping those other males away from his females. In a mangabey group, as I said before, there's usually about 3 males. And so if one male is leaving his group to chase a neighboring group, he's leaving that estrus female sort of undefended, and so she has the opportunity to mate with other males within the group. So he has to prevent that by staying within the group and mate guarding, but all the males are sort of engaged in this simultaneously. And I should also note that it's very important that in a mangabey group, there's usually only one estrus female present at a time. Okay? So this means there's high reproductive skew or high mating skew within the group. So again, I wanted to see if these patterns held up in a broader sample of primate species. And I went through the literature, and there aren't too many studies that report the data that I need. It's right now, I think, about 8 different studies. But here's what we see. So down here, we have populations with high reproductive skew and populations with low reproductive skew. And up here, this is whether food and mates are simultaneously defendable, so they're occurring at the same time. Consecutively defendable, so in some seasons food is defendable, in other seasons mates are defendable. And then here we have populations where there's no food defense because it's neither limiting nor defendable, but there is some mate defense. And what we're looking at is male responses, are the male's likelihood of participating in intergroup conflict in the presence of estrus females. All right? So when there's high reproductive skew, meaning there's basically only one estrus female present in the group at a time, and only one male has access to that female, male participation declines when that estrus female is present because he's too busy mate guarding that female. All right? Conversely, when you have low skew, so multiple estrus females are present, then we see male participation increasing in some populations or not changing at all in this context because they're participating when food is available and they're participating when mates are available. So this is sort of a new hypothesis about when we expect males to participate and the functions of their participation in intergroup conflict in non-human primates. Now, I want to switch a little bit from female-male participation to individual participation. And the context for this is the collective action problem. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. So as you guys probably remember from yesterday and from your own studies, participants bear the costs in a collective action problem, but the benefits are shared communally. And the question is, why are participants tolerating free riders? In the non-human primate literature, especially in the last few years, the cap is bandied about willy-nilly. It comes up very often. And there's always this assumption that there is a collective action problem. And there's no testing of the costs and benefits to determine if these assumptions are borne out. So that's what I wanted to test with one of my study species. So I chose to look at red tails for this purpose, partly because they have more intergroup conflicts than mangabeys, so it's a little bit easier to get the data I need. But also because, so we know that groups are fighting for access to important feeding sites. And what is an important feeding site? It's either a big tree or a grove of small trees. So these are places where there's enough spots for multiple individuals to feed at the same time. Often the whole group can feed in that resource. So these are potentially shareable benefits, where even the defectors, the free riders, have the opportunity to feed in that resource. In any given fight, only a few females are participating, so we see variable participation. Down here, these are my study groups, and on the y-axis, we have the % of adult female participating in a particular intergroup interaction. So for R1, we see very few females are participating in a given fight. For R2, there's at least one fight where 100% of females are participating, but there's some variation here. So this means that there's a high potential for a collective action problem to arise. And I should also note that even though the benefits are potentially shareable, there are dominance hierarchies in these groups. There is conflict over access to food resources, so there might be time for females to prevent others from feeding. So the question is, do they actually prevent them? All right, so I'm going to skip ahead here. First hypothesis, I'm going to stick to this prediction. Maybe there's between individual variation and participation. Sure enough, there is. These females are participating occasionally. These females are not participating. All right, so there's cooperators and non-cooperators. Turns out this is not a permanent designation. It flip-flops from year to year. So that's really interesting. So I don't think it's based on temperament at this point. Another set of predictions testing whether there's actually a collective action problem. What this is telling you is that the cooperator's energy balance increases after an intergroup interaction. So they're able to access that food tree. All right, they're experiencing some benefits after the intergroup interaction. And same thing here. In terms of the cost of fighting, it seems like they're negligible in this particular species. I don't see any deaths. I don't see any obvious wounds as a result of an intergroup interaction. And there's no significant change in the cooperator's energy balance. It's a little bit negative, but not significantly so. So the fighters are not really incurring a cost. And what I want you to get here is that the non-cooperators, they have a low energy balance. This is determined through urine assays of C-peptide. But the cooperators have a higher energy balance. So it's like an energetic wall that they cannot surmount in order to conduct these fights. So a quick summary. Groups fight when food is abundant. There's a tug of war between male and female interests. Within-group competition can prevent participation. And intergroup conflicts are not always a collective action problem. And individuals fight when their energetic balance is at intermediate levels. So not too high, not too low. Thank you.